In the winter of 1836, a man who had already been declared politically dead walked into the coldest, most contested piece of ground in North America, carrying a rifle he'd named Old Betsy and a conviction that almost nobody in power shared. He believed that ordinary men, farmers, clerks, blacksmiths, men with no formal training and no uniforms that matched, could hold a line against a professional army if they were given the chance to prove it. He had said this on the floor of Congress. He had said it in taverns. He had said it to newspaper men who quoted him with a smirk. And when he finally said it with his life, the men who had mocked him were not there to hear it. This is the story of how Davy Crockett died defending an idea that the United States government had already voted against, an idea about who gets to fight for a country and who gets believed when they say they can. Most people who know the name Crockett know the ending. They know the Alamo. They know the mission walls. They know the vague shape of a last stand that has been retold so many times it barely resembles what happened. What almost nobody knows is the argument that came before it, the argument Crockett had been losing for a decade, the one about volunteers versus professionals, about citizen soldiers versus a standing army, about whether the United States should trust the same men who plowed its fields to also defend its frontier. That argument cost Crockett his seat in Congress. It cost him his reputation in Washington. And in a strange, brutal twist that historians still argue about, the way he died became the very proof of the thing nobody in power wanted to admit he was right about. The roots of this argument go back further than Texas, further than the Alamo, back to a Tennessee legislature, and then a Congress that was in the 1820s and 1830s obsessed with a single unglamorous question. How do you defend a country that is mostly wilderness? America did not have the money, the population, or frankly, the appetite for a large standing army. Europe had massive professional forces, disciplined ranks, decades of drilling. America had settlers with muskets scattered across a continent nobody had finished mapping. The men in Washington who favored a strong federal army looked at this arrangement and saw chaos. They looked at volunteer militias, at men who signed up for a campaign and then went home to their farms when it was over, and they saw amateurs. Undisciplined, unreliable, impossible to command with any precision. This was the fashionable opinion among a certain class of officer and politician, and it was an opinion Crockett spent years pushing back against loudly, and usually to his own political detriment. Crockett's own life was the argument in human form. He hadn't come up through West Point or through the drawing rooms of Virginia gentry. He'd grown up desperately poor in East Tennessee, left home as a boy to work off his father's debts, taught himself to read late, and fought in the Creek War not as an officer with a commission, but as a volunteer scout who knew the land better than the men giving orders. He watched, in that war, volunteer companies do things that regular officers said volunteers couldn't do. Hold formation under fire, execute a flanking maneuver without a chain of command barking every step, improvise when the terrain didn't match the map. He came out of that war with a low opinion of rigid military hierarchy and a high opinion of what he called, in his rough and often self-mocking way, common men doing uncommon things. It's worth sitting for a moment on what that scouting work actually involved, because it's easy to wave a hand at volunteer scout and move on. And moving on is exactly how this part of Crockett's life gets lost. He enlisted in the fall of 1813, not because a draft notice arrived, but because word reached his part of Tennessee that Creek warriors had attacked Fort Mims, and the militia companies forming in response were made up of neighbors, men who knew each other's families, men who had no formal training in coordinated maneuver and no officer corps pedigree. Crockett served under men like John Coffee and, at times, in proximity to Andrew Jackson's command, and what he saw there stuck with him for the rest of his life. He saw volunteer companies march for days on half rations because the supply lines a professional army would have insisted on simply didn't exist on the frontier, and he saw them fight anyway. He saw them navigate territory that no map accurately represented, relying on local knowledge that no West Point curriculum could have taught. And when his enlistment ended, he went home, planted his fields, and came back to serve again the following year, which was itself the entire point he would spend the rest of his life making. A volunteer wasn't a soldier who quit when things got hard. A volunteer was a man who kept choosing to come back. When he got to Congress in 1827, he brought that opinion with him, and it put him almost immediately at odds with the political currents of his own era. Andrew Jackson, the man Crockett had once supported, the man whose populist appeal Crockett's own career had ridden in on, was consolidating a very different vision of American power, one built on land removal, financial centralization, and a professionalized federal apparatus. Crockett broke with Jackson publicly, most famously, over the Indian Removal Act, and that break cost him. It cost him patronage, it cost him allies, and it turned him from a rising star into a man the party machine actively worked to defeat. But underneath the more famous fight over removal was a quieter, less remembered fight about military policy, about whether frontier defense should rely on federal regulars stationed in forts or on local volunteer companies who could be raised fast, knew the ground, and fought for their own homes rather than for a paycheck. Crockett argued for the volunteers. He argued that a man defending his own cabin fights differently than a soldier garrisoned 300 miles from anything he loves. He argued that discipline earned through loyalty to a cause outlasts discipline enforced through the lash and the drill sergeant. Almost nobody with real power agreed with him, and the ones who disagreed loudest were the ones writing the military budgets. The men Crockett was up against in these debates were not fools, and it would be a disservice to the actual history to pretend they were. Officers like Winfield Scott, who had spent years trying to modernize American military training along European lines, had legitimate reasons for distrusting militia companies. They had watched, in the War of 1812, volunteer units break and scatter at moments when disciplined regulars held their ground, most infamously at Bladensburg, where militia forces collapsed in front of a smaller British force and left Washington itself undefended, close enough that the British marched in and burned the capital within days. Scott and men like him weren't inventing a prejudice against volunteers out of snobbery. They had a battlefield's worth of evidence that untrained men, however brave in principle, could dissolve into panic when the noise and blood of actual combat arrived, and that panic could cost a war. Crockett never had a clean answer to Bladensburg, and he rarely tried to argue that all volunteer companies would hold under all conditions. What he argued instead, more precisely than his critics ever gave him credit for, was that the difference wasn't volunteer versus regular. It was cause versus coercion. Men who volunteered for a fight they didn't believe in would break exactly the way the men at Bladensburg broke. Men who volunteered for something they believed in, defending their own land, their own families, a cause they'd chosen rather than been assigned to, would hold in ways no drill sergeant could manufacture. It was a subtler argument than the one his opponents were rebutting, and subtlety rarely wins a floor vote. He lost his House seat in 1831, won it back in 1833, and lost it again in 1835. This final defeat handed to him by a Jackson political machine that had grown tired of his independence and his increasingly sharp tongue. The 1835 race against Adam Huntsman was ugly in ways that get sanitized out of the folk hero version of Crockett's biography, full of manufactured pamphlets, exaggerated tales about Crockett's supposed drunkenness and absenteeism, and a coordinated effort by Jackson loyalists to paint him as a has-been who had traded principle for personal vanity. Some of that mudslinging worked because there was a kernel of real vulnerability in it. Crockett had, by his own admission, spent long stretches away from his district promoting his ghost-written memoirs and touring eastern cities where Whig politicians courted him as a potential symbol against Jackson, a role he half enjoyed and half resented, and that absenteeism gave his opponents real ammunition. But underneath the mudslinging was the same substantive fight it had always been. Huntsman and the Jackson machine represented the consolidating, professionalizing wing of American politics, the wing that wanted federal institutions, federal armies, and federal authority run by trained men, answering to a clear hierarchy. Crockett represented, however imperfectly, and however much his own vanity got in the way, the older frontier conviction that authority should be earned locally and defended by the people who actually lived on the land in question. Losing that race wasn't just a personal humiliation. It was the clearest signal yet that his entire political philosophy, the volunteer philosophy, was losing ground nationally, even as it remained popular with the ordinary voters who'd sent him to Congress twice before. The story goes that when he lost that final race, Crockett told his constituents, in a line that has been quoted so often it has nearly become folklore, that they could go to hell and he would go to Texas. It's a good line. It's the kind of line that gets carved onto commemorative plates. But treating it as a joke, as a bit of frontier bravado, misses what was actually happening. Crockett wasn't just leaving in disgust. He was going somewhere his argument might finally get tested for real, a place where the debate between volunteer militia and professional army wasn't academic, wasn't a budget line in a congressional session, but a live question with land, blood, and a border on the line. Texas in late 1835 was a mess of competing loyalties and half-formed institutions, a territory in open revolt against the Mexican government, populated by settlers who were mostly American transplants and who had almost no standing military of their own. What they had instead were volunteers, companies raised in Tennessee and Kentucky and Louisiana, men who heard about the fight and came, some for land grants, some for adventure, some because they genuinely believed in the cause of an independent Texas. The Texian leadership was split, and this split mattered enormously. Sam Houston, commanding what passed for an official army, wanted exactly what the professional army men back in Washington wanted. He wanted consolidation, discipline, a single chain of command, a retreat from exposed positions until a real fighting force could be assembled. He looked at the scattered volunteer garrisons holding indefensible outposts and saw the same thing Crockett's old congressional opponents saw in militia companies, a liability dressed up as an army. The Alamo was exactly the kind of position Houston wanted abandoned. An old mission compound in San Antonio de Bexar, walls built for keeping out raiding parties, not for withstanding artillery, manned by a garrison that never numbered more than around 200 men against a Mexican army under Santa Anna that would eventually number in the thousands. Houston sent orders to blow up the fortifications and pull the garrison back. Jim Bowie, who arrived to carry out those orders, took one look at the situation, at the cannon the Texians had captured, at the strategic value of holding the crossing, and decided to stay and defend it instead. William Travis, the young co-commander, agreed, though the two men had spent the early weeks of February locked in an uncomfortable and occasionally public dispute over who actually held authority over the garrison, Bowie commanding the volunteer forces by informal election among the men themselves, and Travis holding an official commission from the provisional government. That tension, an elected volunteer commander against a formally commissioned officer, was itself a small-scale replay of the exact argument playing out in Washington, and it only resolved because both men, faced with an actual siege bearing down on them, agreed to share command rather than let the dispute fracture the garrison at the worst possible moment. It's a detail worth sitting with, because it shows the volunteer versus professional argument wasn't an abstraction even inside the walls of the Alamo itself. It was a live, unresolved tension among the very men who would die there together, and the fact that they resolved it through negotiation and mutual respect rather than through a chain of command directive is itself a small data point in Crockett's favor. In Crockett, who arrived in early February 1836 with a small company of volunteers from Tennessee, threw his lot in with them not because anyone ordered him to, but because that was precisely the point he had spent a decade arguing. Volunteers didn't need to be ordered. They chose. This is the part of the story that gets flattened in the popular version, the part where Crockett's arrival at the Alamo gets treated as just another beat in a doomed romantic tragedy, tragic music, slow motion, the inevitable ending already written. But if you sit with what he was actually doing, it looks different. Crockett walked into a fortress that the professional military command had already written off, manned overwhelmingly by volunteers exactly like the ones he had spent his career defending, and he did it on purpose, as a kind of living argument. He gave a speech to the garrison, according to several accounts from survivors and witnesses, essentially telling them that he'd rather fight beside men who chose to be there than march under officers who could order him to be anywhere. Whether that account is embellished by later retellings, and some of it almost certainly is, the substance of it fits everything we know about the man's decade of public argument. He believed the volunteer, the man who shows up because he decided to, not because a commission told him to, was the backbone of what America actually was, more than any standing army could ever be. The siege that followed is one of the most mythologized events in American history, and mythologizing tends to erase the actual military reality of what happened, which is worth restoring here because it's the whole point. For 13 days, a garrison made up almost entirely of volunteers and a handful of regulars held a poorly fortified position against a professional army many times its size. They held it not because they had superior weapons or superior training. Most of them had neither. They held it because of something that the professional army theorists back in Washington had insisted volunteers couldn't sustain, which is disciplined, coordinated resistance under sustained pressure day after day without the threat of court-martial keeping them in line. Nobody was going to punish these men for retreating. Travis's famous line drawn in the sand, whether it happened exactly as legend describes it or not, only makes sense in a garrison where the men had to choose to stay every single day, and most of them did. There's a detail from those 13 days that rarely makes it into the retellings, and it matters more than almost anything else in this story. On February 24th, 4 days into the siege, Travis sent out his now famous letter addressed to the people of Texas and all Americans in the world, describing the bombardment, the demand for surrender that Santa Anna had answered with a call for no quarter, and his own refusal to surrender or retreat. That letter went out by courier, and it reached exactly the audience it was written for, other volunteers scattered across Texas, who were under no obligation to march toward a fortress that was almost certainly going to fall. A handful of them came anyway. 32 men from Gonzales, a settlement barely a day's ride away, slipped through Mexican lines on March 1st and joined the garrison, doubling nothing, changing no strategic calculation, adding 32 more names to a death toll that was already effectively decided. Nobody ordered those 32 men to go. There was no chain of command that could have compelled them. They went because Travis's letter asked, and because the volunteer logic Crockett had spent a decade defending in Congress was, at that exact moment, playing out in real time in a way no congressional hearing could have staged. A call went out. Men who didn't have to answer answered anyway. They lost, of course. On March 6, 1836, Santa Anna's forces breached the walls in the early morning, and the defenders were overwhelmed and killed Crockett among them, though the exact manner of his death has been disputed for nearly 2 centuries, with some accounts describing him fighting to the last and others, based on a diary attributed to a Mexican officer named José Enrique de la Peña, describing him as one of a handful of survivors captured and then executed on Santa Anna's orders. Historians still argue about which version is more accurate, and the argument itself has become almost a proxy war for how Americans want to remember the man, as a fighting martyr or as a captured prisoner killed in cold blood. But strip away the argument over the final minutes and look instead at the 13 days that preceded them, and you get a much clearer answer to Crockett's decade-long congressional fight than any single death scene could provide. The volunteers held. That's the fact that matters, the fact that it got buried under the myth. A garrison of men who had no obligation to be there, who could have walked away at any point without facing so much as a reprimand, held a hopeless position against overwhelming odds for nearly 2 weeks, and it took the full weight of a professional army with artillery to finally break them. This was precisely the scenario Crockett had argued would happen, and precisely the scenario the professional army advocates in Washington had insisted was impossible. Men without formal discipline, without the threat of institutional punishment, holding a line purely on conviction. And the tragedy, the real tragedy, isn't just that they died. It's that almost nobody who mattered in Washington was paying attention to what their deaths actually proved. The Alamo got absorbed almost instantly into a different narrative, a story about martyrdom and vengeance, a rallying cry for Sam Houston's regular forces at San Jacinto just weeks later. Remember the Alamo becoming a slogan that served Houston's professional army rather than a lesson about what volunteer forces were capable of. There's a bitter irony buried in that timeline that most retellings skip entirely. The battle that avenged the Alamo, San Jacinto, was won in 18 minutes by a force under Houston's command, a force that by that point included plenty of volunteers too. But the victory got folded into the mythology of Houston's leadership and his professional military strategy rather than into any vindication of Crockett's argument about the volunteer soldier. Houston, the man who had wanted the Alamo abandoned entirely, who had never believed the position could or should be held, became the hero who avenged it. Crockett, who had proven for 13 days that the volunteer soldier could hold a line as well as any regular, became a martyr whose actual argument got lost inside his own legend. Congress, which had rejected Crockett as a politician and largely rejected his military philosophy as impractical frontier sentiment, now had a folk hero it could safely celebrate precisely because he was dead and couldn't argue the point anymore. And here is where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable if you're willing to sit with it instead of reaching for the easy, patriotic version. The volunteer militia system Crockett championed did not, in fact, get validated by Washington after the Alamo. If anything, the opposite happened. The decades following Texas independence saw the U.S. military establishment move steadily toward professionalization, toward standing armies, toward exactly the model Crockett had spent his career resisting. The Mexican-American War just a decade later was fought with a combination of volunteers and regulars, and the post-war analysis largely concluded that volunteer units, while capable of individual bravery, needed far more structured integration with professional command than Crockett's generation of frontier romantics had imagined. By the time of the Civil War, the volunteer regiments that flooded into service on both sides were absorbed almost immediately into rigid, professionalized command structures, drilled relentlessly, disciplined harshly. Because the lesson the military establishment took from decades of frontier conflict wasn't that volunteers could fight as well as regulars without structure. It was that volunteers needed structure imposed on them from above to be reliable at scale. Crockett's vision, the vision he died proving at a small mission compound in Texas, was not the vision that shaped American military doctrine going forward. The professionals he'd spent his career arguing against essentially won the long game, even as his individual death became one of the most celebrated moments in American folklore. You can trace that institutional victory in the paperwork, if you go looking for it, in a way that's almost more damning than any speech. The militia acts and appropriations debates of the following decades increasingly funneled resources toward a professionalized officer corps, toward West Point's expanding role as the gatekeeper of military leadership, toward standardized training manuals that treated the old frontier style of ad hoc volunteer command as a liability to be trained out of new recruits rather than a strength to be preserved. By the time you reach the Mexican-American War in 1846, the volunteer regiments that served alongside Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott's regulars were viewed with exactly the mixture of usefulness and suspicion that had characterized the debate in Crockett's day, capable of ferocious individual courage, prone to disorder, most valuable when folded tightly under professional oversight rather than left to organize themselves. The institutional memory of the Alamo, in other words, wasn't trust the volunteers. It was the volunteers held longer than expected, but we still needed Houston's more conventional force to actually win the war. That's a real distinction, and it's the distinction the professionals in Washington kept making for the rest of the century. So what was Crockett actually right about if the institutional argument went the other way? This is the question worth sitting with, because the easy version of this story, the version that gets you the most enthusiastic comments and the least interesting truth, is that Crockett was simply vindicated, proven right, a prophet nobody listened to. The more honest version is stranger and more interesting than that. Crockett was right about something specific and narrow, not something broad and institutional. He was right that a garrison of volunteers, given no coercion and no promise of survival, motivated only by conviction, could hold a nearly indefensible position against a vastly superior force for far longer than any rational military calculation would predict. That is a fact about human motivation and human courage that 13 days at the Alamo demonstrated beyond argument. He was wrong, or at least the institutions he fought were proven more durable on this point, that this kind of motivation could be scaled, systematized, or relied upon as the backbone of a national defense strategy. The volunteer spirit that held the Alamo wall by wall for 13 days was not something you could build an army doctrine around. and the men who built American military policy in the decades after his death understood that better than he did, even as they built statues to the man who'd proven the opposite point on a smaller, human scale. This is why nobody believed him, and why, in a deeper sense, nobody ever fully vindicated him either. His argument was too small for the institutions that needed to hear it, and too true for the myth that eventually replaced it. Congress didn't believe a backwoods representative who argued that untrained farmers could outfight professional soldiers, because on the scale Congress had to think at, appropriating money for a continent's worth of defense, that argument didn't hold up, and history mostly proved the skeptics right about that scale. But on the scale of one mission compound, one wall, 13 days, and roughly 200 men who chose every single morning to stay when they could have left, Crockett was exactly right. And almost nobody who could have used that truth for anything larger was paying attention to it at the time, and almost nobody has paid proper attention to it since, because the legend was so much easier to tell than the argument underneath it. What's left, nearly 2 centuries later, is a strange kind of half-vindication that doesn't fit neatly into the folk hero version of Crockett that gets taught in classrooms and stamped onto coonskin caps sold in gift shops. He wasn't a prophet ignored by history. He was a man with a specific, testable belief about the nature of courage and coercion, who staked his life on proving it in the one setting where it could actually be tested cleanly, without the noise of national budgets and institutional politics clouding the result. And he was right, in that narrow, human, unglamorous sense that doesn't scale up into policy or doctrine, but scales down perfectly into the story of 13 days when men who didn't have to stay stayed anyway. That's the part of the story that never quite made it into the myth. Not that Crockett died a hero, everyone already knew that part, but that he died proving a point almost nobody in power was interested in hearing, a point about ordinary people and extraordinary conviction, made at exactly the moment and place where it could never be dismissed as theory again, and then buried anyway, underneath a legend that was more useful to everyone than the argument it came from. There's a reason this particular shape of story keeps happening across different wars and different centuries, and it's worth naming plainly instead of leaving it as an implication. Institutions remember outcomes. They remember who won the war, who signed the treaty, whose strategy got credited in the official report. They are far worse at remembering the smaller, harder to quantify truths buried inside those outcomes. The truths about why individual men held a line when nothing was forcing them to, because those truths don't fit neatly into a budget request or a training manual. Crockett understood something about human motivation that the institutions around him were simply not built to measure. And the tragedy of his life isn't that he was ignored by fools. It's that he was ignored by reasonably intelligent people, operating with a reasonably sound set of institutional priorities that had no good way of accounting for the thing he was actually talking about. You cannot put "a man will hold a wall for 13 days because he chose to be there" into an appropriations bill. You can only watch it happen once in a place like the Alamo, and then argue for the rest of your life about what it meant. And that argument never really ended. It shows up again in the way modern historians still can't agree on how Crockett actually died, fighting to his last breath or captured and executed, because even his death has become a battlefield for the same underlying question: whether the myth of the defiant volunteer needs to be literally true to matter, or whether the 13 days that came before it were always the real proof regardless of how the final minutes actually played out. It shows up in the way, remember, the Alamo got weaponized almost instantly by the very command structure Crockett had spent his life resisting, turned into a slogan for Houston's regular forces rather than a lesson about the volunteers who made the slogan necessary in the first place. And it shows up, finally, in the strange fact that nearly 200 years later, people still argue over whether Crockett was a fool who threw his life away on a lost cause, or a man who understood something true about conviction that no institution before or since has ever managed to fully account for. Maybe the honest answer is that he was both, a man whose specific, narrow, human truth was real and worth dying for, inside a broader argument about how nations should organize their defense that history mostly decided against him. That's not the tidy ending most retellings reach for, but it's the one the actual record supports, and it's the one worth telling. Because the tidy version, the version where Crockett is simply a martyr proven right, erases the very thing that makes his story matter, which is that being right about people and being right about institutions are two entirely different kinds of being right. And Davy Crockett, whatever else you want to say about him, only ever claimed the first one.